The conference room was so quiet I could hear my husband tapping his wedding ring against the glass table like he had already won. His smug smile said everything he thought. I was about to lose my home, my savings, and half the company I helped him build. But as his lawyer confidently slid our prenup across the table, I reached into my purse and placed a second envelope on the table. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction inspired by dramatic narratives. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. Viewer discretion is advised. Everyone used to say we had the kind of marriage people dream about. The kind you see in curated Instagram posts and wedding highlight reels, where every smile looks effortless and every moment seems touched by luck. From the outside, we were the perfect couple, successful, attractive, and deeply in love. At least, that's what I believed too for a long time. I trusted the version of us that the world saw, because it was easier than questioning the quiet discomfort that sometimes crept in when no one else was around. We met at a time when everything in my life felt uncertain. I was building my career from scratch, juggling long hours and self-doubt, trying to prove that I could stand on my own. He entered my life like stability personified, confident, composed, and already established. He had a way of speaking that made everything sound certain, like he had already figured life out while the rest of us were still guessing. I admired that about him. It made me feel safe. In the beginning, he was attentive in ways that felt almost too good to be true. He remembered small details, anticipated my needs, and always seemed to know exactly what to say. When I doubted myself, he would reassure me. When I hesitated, he would take the lead. I told myself this was what partnership looked like, two people balancing each other out. I didn't realize then that slowly, almost invisibly, the balance was shifting entirely in his favor. As our relationship grew, so did his influence over my decisions. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, subtle enough that I never felt like I was losing control. He would suggest what I should wear to certain events, framing it as helpful advice. He would recommend which friends were good for my image and which ones I should distance myself from. He even started giving input on my work choices, encouraging me to take opportunities that aligned more with his long-term plans than my own. At the time, I interpreted all of this as care. I thought he was invested in my success, in our future together. I didn't see how often my voice became secondary to his. I didn't notice how frequently I deferred to his judgment, even when something inside me quietly disagreed. When we got married, it felt like the natural next step in a story that had been building perfectly. The wedding was everything people expected: elegant, emotional, unforgettable. Our families were proud, our friends were envious, and I stood there believing I had made the best decision of my life. I remember looking at him during the ceremony, thinking how lucky I was to have found someone so sure, someone who made everything feel so secure. After the wedding, our life together seemed even more polished. We moved into a beautiful home, hosted dinners that people talked about for weeks, and built a reputation as a power couple. He thrived in that image. He knew how to present us, how to make our life look aspirational. And I played my role perfectly, standing beside him, smiling when expected, supporting him in every public setting. But behind closed doors, there were moments, small, almost insignificant, that didn't match the image. Times when his tone would shift, becoming colder, more calculated. Moments when disagreements weren't really discussions but quiet reminders that he always had the final say. He never raised his voice, never did anything that could be clearly labeled as wrong. Instead, he controlled situations with calm precision, making it hard to even explain why something felt off. I began to notice how finances were handled entirely under his supervision. At first it made sense. He had more experience, more knowledge. But over time I realized how little visibility I actually had into our accounts, our investments, even the contracts tied to the business we were building together. Whenever I asked questions, he would answer just enough to satisfy me, often wrapping his explanations in reassurance that everything was taken care of. There were also subtle patterns in how he spoke about loyalty and trust. He valued them highly, at least in words, but there was always an underlying expectation that I prove mine more than he proved his. If I questioned anything, even lightly, it would turn into a conversation about how important it was to stand united, to not let doubt weaken what we had built. Over time, I stopped asking certain questions altogether. Looking back, I can see how carefully everything was constructed. The image, the dynamic, even my own perception of our marriage. It wasn't built on chaos or obvious conflict. It was built on control disguised as care, on confidence that overshadowed my instincts, on a narrative so convincing that I didn't think to challenge it. To everyone else, we were still perfect. To me, we were still good, just with occasional moments of discomfort I couldn't quite explain. I told myself every marriage had its complexities, its compromises. I believed that what we had was strong enough to withstand those small, unspoken tensions. I didn't realize that those small moments were the foundation of something much bigger, something that had been quietly unfolding behind the scenes long before I ever thought to question it. The first time he brought up the prenup, he did it so casually that it almost didn't register as something important. We were sitting in the living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes and wedding planning notes scattered across the table, the air filled with the kind of excitement that comes from building a future together. He leaned back on the couch, watching me go over guest lists, and said it in the same tone he used when suggesting a restaurant or adjusting travel plans. Practical. Reasonable. Harmless. "I think we should get a prenup," he said, as if it were just another step in the process. I remember pausing for a second, pen hovering above the paper, trying to process the shift in conversation. It wasn't that I didn't understand what a prenup was. I did. But it felt out of place in that moment, like introducing doubt into something that had always felt certain. I looked up at him, searching his face for something: hesitation, maybe, or concern. But there was nothing except calm confidence. "It's just protection," he added quickly, as if he had already anticipated my reaction. For both of us. That was the first time I noticed how carefully he chose his words. He didn't frame it as something he needed. He framed it as something we both needed. A shared safeguard. A mutual decision. It sounded fair, logical even, and I told myself that resisting it would only make me seem emotional or unreasonable. Still, something inside me shifted slightly. Not enough to question him outright, but enough to create a quiet tension I couldn't ignore. I asked a few basic questions: what it would include, why it was necessary, whether it was something we could discuss in more detail later. He answered each one smoothly, like he had already rehearsed the conversation in his head. "It's standard," he said. "People in our position do this all the time. It just avoids complications later. You never know what life throws at you." There was something about that phrase, "you never know," that lingered with me longer than it should have. It introduced a possibility I hadn't considered, a future where things didn't work out. I had never thought about our relationship in those terms. To me, we were building something permanent. To him, it seemed like he was already accounting for its potential end. But he didn't give me much time to sit with that thought. He shifted the conversation back to logistics, to wedding details, to everything that felt exciting and certain. By the end of the evening, the prenup had been reduced to just another item on a long checklist. Over the next few days, he brought it up again, always in the same measured tone. He emphasized how it would protect us from external pressures, from family disputes, from unnecessary legal complications. He made it sound like an act of responsibility, not distrust. And every time I hesitated, he reassured me in a way that made my concerns feel smaller, almost insignificant. "You trust me, right?" he asked once, not accusingly but gently enough that saying anything other than yes felt wrong. "Of course I do," I replied without thinking. That answer seemed to settle everything for him, at least. For me, it created a strange contradiction. If I trusted him completely, then why did this feel uncomfortable? And if it felt uncomfortable, did that mean there was something I wasn't seeing clearly? When he arranged for us to meet with a lawyer, it all started moving faster than I expected. The documents were presented in a way that made them seem routine, almost generic. Legal language filled the pages, dense and formal, designed to be skimmed rather than fully understood. He guided me through it, pointing out key sections, summarizing terms, and assuring me that everything was balanced. "It's straightforward," he said. "Nothing unusual." I wanted to believe him. I really did. And yet, there were moments during that meeting where I felt slightly out of place, like I was being guided through something I didn't fully control. The lawyer seemed more aligned with him than with me, responding to his cues, directing explanations toward his concerns. I noticed how quickly he would step in whenever I lingered on a clause for too long, gently steering the conversation forward. Not forcefully, not in a way that would raise immediate suspicion, but enough to keep things moving at his pace rather than mine. "Don't overthink it," he told me afterward, smiling in that reassuring way that had always made me feel safe. "It's just paperwork." That phrase stayed with me longer than I expected. Just paperwork. Something about reducing a document that could shape our entire future to something so minor didn't sit right. But I pushed the feeling aside, convincing myself that I was being overly cautious. The pressure wasn't overt, but it was consistent. There was always a sense of urgency, a subtle reminder that this needed to be finalized before the wedding. Dates were mentioned, deadlines implied, and I found myself caught between wanting to fully understand what I was signing and not wanting to disrupt the flow of everything we had planned. At one point, I suggested taking more time to review it independently, maybe even consulting another lawyer. His reaction was immediate, though still controlled. "Why complicate things?" he asked. "We already have a professional handling it. Bringing someone else in just creates confusion." He didn't say no directly, he didn't forbid it, but the way he framed it made it seem unnecessary, even inconvenient. Like questioning the process was an obstacle rather than a precaution. I remember sitting alone later that night, the document open in front of me, trying to read through the clauses on my own. The language felt heavy, difficult to interpret without guidance. I told myself I would go through it carefully, that I wouldn't sign anything I didn't fully understand. But at the same time, I could hear his voice in my head. Calm and certain, telling me it was all standard. All normal, all designed to protect us. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to rely on his certainty more than my own doubts. At first, the changes were so minor they barely registered as anything unusual. Life continued in the same polished rhythm we had always maintained, and if anything, it looked like we were becoming even more successful, more stable, more aligned. But beneath that surface, small inconsistencies began to appear. Details that didn't quite fit. Moments that felt slightly off but were easy to dismiss if I didn't look too closely. It started with things like timing. He would say he was working late, which wasn't unusual given how demanding his schedule had always been. But there were nights when his explanations felt too rehearsed, too precise, like he had prepared them in advance. If I asked a simple follow-up question, his answers would become shorter, less detailed, as if he didn't want to risk saying too much. At the time, I told myself I was overanalyzing. People get tired. They simplify. It didn't have to mean anything more than that. Then there were the phone calls. He had always taken business calls, even during dinners or late at night, so that wasn't new. What changed with how he handled them? He started stepping out of the room more often, lowering his voice, ending conversations abruptly if I walked in. Once or twice, I caught fragments names I didn't recognize, references to meetings I hadn't heard about. When I asked him casually who he had been speaking to, he would brush it off with something vague. "Just work," he'd say, as if that explained everything. I noticed the pattern, but I didn't confront it. Instead, I adjusted my expectations, convincing myself that this was what success looked like: busier schedules, more privacy, less time to share every detail. It was easier to accept that explanation than to question why transparency was slowly disappearing from our relationship. The financial side of things shifted more noticeably, though it still happened in a way that felt gradual rather than sudden. He had always taken the lead on managing our accounts and investments, but now there were more things I wasn't fully aware of. Statements stopped arriving in shared folders. Passwords were changed without discussion. When I asked about it, he explained that he was streamlining everything, making it more efficient. "You don't need to worry about this," he told me one evening, his tone calm but firm. "I've got it handled." There was something about that phrase, how easily he said it, how final it sounded, that made me pause. It wasn't just reassurance anymore. It was a boundary, a quiet line being drawn, separating what I was allowed to see from what I wasn't. I tried to push back gently at first, asking for more involvement, more clarity. But every attempt seemed to circle back to the same conclusion. He knew what he was doing, and I should trust him. And I did trust him. And I did trust him. Or at least I wanted to. So I let it go, even when the discomfort lingered longer each time. The lies themselves weren't dramatic. They weren't the kind that immediately shattered trust. They were small, almost insignificant on their own, details that didn't match up, timelines that shifted slightly, explanations that changed depending on when I asked. Individually, they were easy to overlook. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore forever. One moment that stayed with me happened on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. I had been organizing some documents at home when I came across a file that didn't belong to anything I recognized. It wasn't hidden exactly, just placed in a way that suggested it wasn't meant for me to pay attention to it. Out of curiosity, I opened it, expecting it to be something mundane. What I found instead was a series of financial summaries and notes that referenced accounts and transactions I had never seen before. The numbers were significant, far beyond what I thought we had allocated for certain projects. There were annotations in his handwriting, outlining strategies and projections. But none of it had ever been discussed with me. My first reaction wasn't anger, it was confusion. I stared at the pages, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, wondering if I had simply missed something along the way. Maybe he had mentioned it, and I hadn't paid enough attention. Maybe it was part of a larger plan he hadn't had time to explain yet. When he came home that evening, I debated whether to bring it up. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation. Another part hesitated, unsure of how he would react, unsure of what it would mean if my suspicions were confirmed. In the end, I chose a softer approach. I mentioned the file casually, watching his expression carefully as I spoke. For a brief moment, just a second, something shifted in his eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or calculation. It was gone so quickly I almost doubted I had seen it. "Oh, that," he said, his tone returning to normal almost instantly. "It's nothing important. Just some preliminary work." The answer felt incomplete, but it was delivered with enough confidence to make pushing further feel unnecessary, almost intrusive. I nodded, pretending to accept it, even though the unease inside me had grown stronger. After that, I started noticing more. Not because things had suddenly changed, but because I was finally paying attention. Every small inconsistency stood out more clearly. Every vague answer felt more deliberate. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a version of our life that didn't align with the one I had believed in. Still, I didn't act on it right away. I didn't accuse him or demand the truth. Instead, I watched. I listened. I started piecing things together quietly, trying to understand the full picture before reacting. Because deep down, I had begun to realize that whatever was happening wasn't random or accidental. It was intentional, carefully constructed. And if I confronted it too soon, I risked losing the chance to see just how far it went. The day I found the hidden folder didn't begin with suspicion. It started like any other quiet afternoon, the kind where the house felt still and predictable, where routines unfolded without interruption. He had left early for work, mentioning a meeting he couldn't miss, and I stayed behind to handle a few things at home. There was nothing unusual about it. In fact, it felt almost peaceful, like a rare moment where everything slowed down enough for me to catch up on the details I had been neglecting. I had decided to organize his study, something I hadn't done in a while. It wasn't off limits, but it had gradually become more his space than ours. Papers were neatly stacked, drawers carefully arranged, everything appearing controlled and intentional. At first glance, there was nothing out of place. But as I moved through the room, sorting through files and aligning documents, I started noticing how selective the organization felt. Some sections were meticulously labeled, while others were left vague, almost deliberately understated. I opened drawer after drawer, finding nothing more than business papers, contracts, and notes that fit the image he had always presented. Structured, professional, transparent. It was almost convincing enough to quiet the lingering doubts that had been building in my mind. Almost. Then I reached the bottom drawer of his desk. It wasn't locked, but it resisted slightly when I pulled it open, as if it hadn't been used recently. Inside, everything looked ordinary at first. Folders, stacked in a way that suggested routine storage rather than secrecy. But something about the placement felt off. One folder in particular was tucked slightly beneath the others, not hidden entirely, but positioned just enough to avoid immediate attention. I hesitated for a moment before pulling it out. There was no clear reason for the hesitation, just an instinct that this wasn't something I was meant to find. Still, curiosity pushed me forward. I told myself it was probably nothing. Just another set of documents I hadn't seen before. The folder was plain, unmarked, giving away nothing about its contents. When I opened it, the first few pages looked like standard legal paperwork, typed, formatted, filled with language that felt familiar but dense. I skimmed through them casually at first, expecting to recognize something that would place them within the context of his work. But as I turned each page, a strange realization began to form. These weren't random documents. They were structured, deliberate, and most importantly personal. My name appeared on the third page. I froze, my fingers tightening around the paper as I read the line again, making sure I hadn't misunderstood. It wasn't just a mention. It was central to the document. My name, his name, references to assets, conditions, clauses that outlined scenarios I had never discussed, never agreed to. A quiet heaviness settled in my chest as I flipped to the next page, then the next. Each section revealed something more calculated than the last. It wasn't just a document, it was a strategy. A plan laid out in precise legal terms, detailing outcomes that seemed to anticipate conflict, separation, even loss. The language was clinical, detached, but the intent behind it felt anything but. There were clauses that heavily favored him, conditions that placed limitations on what I could claim, what I could access. Some of them resembled the prenup I had signed, but others were entirely new variations, amendments, structures I had never seen before. My mind struggled to process what I was reading. For a moment, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a draft, something that had been revised and never finalized. Maybe it was part of a broader legal review that didn't directly apply to us. But the more I read, the harder it became to hold on to those explanations. There were notes in the margins, written in his handwriting. Short, precise comments that clarified intent, highlighted key advantages, and in some cases, outlined how certain clauses could be enforced. It wasn't just a passive document. It was something he had actively worked on, refined, and understood in detail. I sat there, the folder open in front of me, feeling the weight of everything shift all at once. The small inconsistencies, the vague answers, the controlled access to information, they all began to align in a way that made sense, but not in the way I had hoped. This wasn't just about a lack of transparency anymore. It was about deliberate concealment. I flipped back to the first page, reading more carefully this time, paying attention to dates, signatures, references. Some of the timelines didn't match what I remembered. There were indications that parts of this had been prepared before our wedding, possibly even before the prenup I had signed was finalized. That realization hit harder than anything else. If this existed before the agreement I had trusted, then what exactly had I agreed to? And more importantly, what had he led me to believe? For a brief moment, anger surfaced sharp, immediate, demanding action. I imagined confronting him, placing the folder in front of him, forcing him to explain every line, every decision. But just as quickly as the anger rose, it was replaced by something else. Clarity. Because reacting immediately would give him control. It would allow him to shape the narrative, to explain, to deflect, to minimize what I had found. And if there was one thing I understood in that moment, it was that whatever this was, it wasn't accidental. It was intentional. planned, and likely supported by more information I hadn't yet uncovered. I closed the folder slowly, my thoughts shifting from shock to strategy. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of understanding it fully. If he had gone to this extent to create and hide something like this, then there was more beneath the surface. I placed the folder back exactly where I had found it, careful to align it the same way, to leave no indication that it had been touched. Every movement felt deliberate, controlled, as if I were stepping into a role I hadn't realized I needed to play until now. When I finally left the room, nothing about the house had changed. Everything looked the same, felt the same. But I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer seeing it the same way. The instinct to confront him came almost immediately after I found the folder. It would have been the natural reaction: demand answers, force clarity, put everything out in the open. I could already imagine the scene, placing the documents in front of him, watching his expression shift, waiting for him to explain what I had just discovered. For a brief moment, that felt like the right thing to do. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Because if he had gone to the extent of creating something like that, hiding it in plain sight, and maintaining the version of reality I had been living in, then he wasn't careless. He was deliberate. And confronting someone who operates that way without understanding the full picture isn't confrontation, it's surrender. That realization changed everything. Instead of reacting, I chose to observe. Instead of exposing what I knew, I decided to protect it. I told myself that whatever truth existed beneath all of this, I needed to see it clearly before I made a single move. And that meant pretending nothing had changed. The first step was the hardest: acting normal. It sounds simple, but it required constant control. Every word, every reaction, every glance had to match the version of me he expected to see. I couldn't let curiosity show, couldn't let suspicion slip through even in the smallest way. Because if he sensed that something was off, he would adjust. And I couldn't afford that, so I smiled when he came home. I asked about his day the same way I always had. I listened to his answers, even when they sounded too smooth, too rehearsed. And for the first time, I wasn't just hearing what he said. I was analyzing how he said it. There were patterns I hadn't noticed before. The way he deflected certain questions, redirecting conversations with ease. The way he offered just enough detail to appear transparent, but never enough to be fully clear. It was subtle, almost impressive in its consistency, and it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This wasn't new behavior. I had just been too trusting to see it. I started paying closer attention to everything around me. Not in an obvious way, but quietly, methodically. I noticed when he took calls, how often he stepped out of the room, how his tone shifted depending on who he was speaking to. I observed the rhythm of his schedule, the inconsistencies in his routines. Things that once felt normal now stood out with sharp clarity. At the same time, I began to gather information. It didn't start as some grand plan. It was small at first: checking shared documents, reviewing emails I had access to, going through records that were already within reach. I wasn't breaking into anything or crossing any lines yet. I was simply looking more carefully at what had always been there. And what I found, even in those early stages, was enough to keep me going. There were discrepancies in financial records, transactions that didn't align with what I had been told, accounts that weren't fully disclosed. There were references to meetings and agreements that had never been mentioned to me. None of it was definitive on its own, but together it painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Still, I didn't rush. Because every time I uncovered something new, it reinforced the same idea. This was bigger than a single document, bigger than one lie. It was a system, a carefully constructed version of reality that he had been maintaining over time. And dismantling something like that required more than just proof. It required precision. I also knew that I couldn't do this alone. The thought of involving someone else made me hesitate at first. Trust had already been compromised, and the idea of extending it again felt risky. But I understood that navigating something this complex, especially the legal aspects, wasn't something I could handle without guidance. So I started considering my options quietly. I thought about who I could approach without it getting back to him. who had the expertise to interpret what I was finding without alerting anyone connected to him. It had to be someone independent, someone who would see the situation clearly without bias. In the meantime, I continued to play my role. If anything, I became better at it. I leaned into the version of myself he was comfortable with, the supportive partner, the trusting wife, the one who didn't question too deeply. It wasn't deception for the sake of manipulation. It was strategy, a way to maintain access, to keep the illusion intact while I worked behind the scenes. There were moments when it felt exhausting, when the weight of what I knew threatened to break through the calm exterior I was maintaining. Sitting across from him at dinner, listening to him talk as if everything was exactly as it seemed, required a level of restraint I hadn't known I possessed. But those moments also strengthened my resolve. Because every time he spoke with that same confidence, that same certainty, it reminded me of what was at stake. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about reclaiming control over my life, my choices, and the future he had been quietly trying to shape without me. I began to see things more clearly than I ever had before. Not just his actions, but my own role in everything that had led to this point. The trust I had given so freely, the questions I hadn't asked, the instincts I had ignored. It wasn't about blame. It was about awareness. And with that awareness came a shift. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. Every piece of information I gathered, every pattern I identified, every detail I confirmed became part of something larger. A foundation I was building carefully, step by step, without drawing attention to it. Because I knew that when the time came to act, it wouldn't be enough to simply reveal what I had found. It had to be undeniable, precise, timed in a way that left no room for him to recover, to explain it away, or to regain control of the narrative. Deciding to involve a lawyer wasn't a moment of confidence. It was a calculated risk. Up until that point, everything I had done was contained within the boundaries of observation. I was gathering information, connecting patterns, and slowly building a clearer understanding of what was happening. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized that I was stepping into territory I couldn't navigate alone. The documents I had found weren't just personal. They were legal, structured in a way that required expertise to fully interpret. And if I misread even a single detail, I could lose whatever advantage I had gained by staying silent. The challenge wasn't just finding a lawyer. It was finding the right one. I couldn't go to anyone within his network. He had too many connections, too much influence. Even a casual inquiry could reach him if I wasn't careful. I needed someone completely independent, someone with no ties to him or his business. Someone who would approach the situation with objectivity and discretion. It took time to narrow down my options, researching quietly, cross-checking names, making sure there were no overlaps I hadn't considered. When I finally scheduled the meeting, I did it under the pretense of handling a personal legal matter, unrelated to my marriage. I chose a time when I knew he would be occupied, somewhere he wouldn't question my absence. Every detail mattered. Even something as small as a phone call at the wrong time could unravel everything I had been trying to keep hidden. Walking into that office felt different from anything I had experienced before. It wasn't fear exactly, but a heightened awareness that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Until then, everything had existed in a space of uncertainty, suspicions, observations, partial truths. This meeting had the potential to turn those into something concrete, something that would demand action. The lawyer I met with didn't know me, didn't know my husband. And that was exactly what I needed. I didn't give away everything at once. Instead, I started carefully, presenting a simplified version of the situation, watching their reactions, gauging how they interpreted what I was saying. I needed to know if I could trust their judgment before I revealed anything more sensitive. As the conversation progressed, I began sharing the documents I had found. Not all of them at first, just enough to establish context. I paid close attention to how the lawyer responded, not just to the content, but to the structure, the language, the intent behind what was written. There was a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when their expression changed. It wasn't dramatic. Just a slight pause before they continued reviewing the pages. That pause told me everything I needed to know. Whatever I had uncovered wasn't normal. "Where did you get this?" they asked eventually, their tone measured but more focused than before. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered honestly without unnecessary detail, but without hiding the source. Their reaction didn't shift, but the way they approached the documents did. They weren't just reading anymore. They were analyzing. What followed was a level of clarity I hadn't been prepared for. The lawyer explained that what I had found wasn't just an alternative version of our prenup, it was a structured legal strategy. The clauses weren't random or poorly written. They were intentional, designed to create specific outcomes under very controlled conditions. Some of the provisions, as they pointed out, were heavily skewed, placing me at a significant disadvantage in scenarios that had clearly been anticipated in advance. But what stood out the most wasn't just the imbalance. It was the inconsistency. "This doesn't align with a standard prenup," they said, tapping one of the pages lightly. "In fact, parts of this contradict what would typically be enforceable, depending on how it was executed." That statement shifted everything. Until that moment, I had assumed that whatever he had put in place, it was legally solid. That his confidence came from knowing he had structured everything correctly. But now, there was a new possibility that the strength of his position wasn't as absolute as he believed. The lawyer asked if I had a copy of the prenup I had signed. I did. I had kept it, even though I hadn't fully understood it at the time. When I provided it, the comparison began. Watching them go through both documents side by side felt surreal. Page by page, clause by clause, they identified differences, some subtle, others significant. Certain sections had been altered in ways that changed their meaning entirely. Others had been omitted or replaced with language that shifted control more heavily in his favor. "Did you review this independently before signing?" they asked. The question wasn't accusatory, but it carried weight. I answered honestly. I hadn't. I had relied on the explanations I was given, trusted the process as it was presented to me. The lawyer nodded, as if confirming something internally. "That matters," they said. "Because how this was presented to you, and what you were led to believe you were signing, could affect how this holds up." That was the moment everything clicked into place. This wasn't just about him hiding information or manipulating circumstances. It was about misrepresentation. About creating a version of reality that guided my decisions while withholding the truth that would have allowed me to make them differently. The implications of that were far greater than I had anticipated. As the meeting continued, the lawyer outlined possible scenarios, not conclusions, not guarantees, but pathways. They explained what could be challenged, what would require further evidence, what steps I would need to take if I decided to move forward. It wasn't simple, and it wasn't immediate, but it was possible. And for the first time since I had opened that folder, I felt something shift in my favor. Not because the situation was resolved, but because it was no longer one-sided. The control I thought I had lost wasn't gone. It had just been obscured. And now that I understood the structure he had built, I could begin to see where it could be dismantled. Before I left, the lawyer gave me one piece of advice that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. "Don't confront him yet," they said. "If he doesn't know what you know, that's your advantage. Once you reveal it, you lose control over how he responds." I already understood that on some level, but hearing it confirmed by someone who saw the legal landscape as clearly as they did made it definitive. This wasn't the moment to act. It was the moment to prepare with precision, knowing that the next steps I took wouldn't just expose the truth, they would determine how much of it worked in my favor. Once I understood the legal reality of what he had done, everything about the way I saw him changed. Not outwardly on the surface. I continued to behave exactly as I always had, but internally, the illusion was gone. The confidence he carried, the certainty in his voice, the way he moved through our life, as if every outcome was already secured in his favor, it no longer intimidated me. If anything, it became useful. Because the more confident he was, the less careful he became. That realization shaped everything I did next. I stopped looking for immediate answers and started focusing on long-term positioning. Every interaction became an opportunity not to confront, but to confirm. I paid attention to what he assumed I knew, what he casually revealed when he thought there was no risk, and what he never bothered to hide because he believed I would never question it. He continued exactly as before, unaware that anything had changed. If anything, his behavior leaned further into control, but now it came with a layer of overconfidence that hadn't been as visible before. He spoke more openly about financial strategies, about restructuring certain assets, about decisions that would protect what he had built. And every time he used that word protect, it carried a different meaning now. It wasn't about protecting us. It was about protecting himself. I listened carefully, storing details without reacting. When he mentioned moving funds, I made a note of the timing. When he referred to agreements or meetings, I tracked the context. It wasn't about catching him in a single lie anymore. It was about building a timeline, understanding the full scope of what he had been doing, and how long it had been in motion. At the same time, I continued working with the lawyer, but quietly. There were no obvious calls, no messages that could be traced easily. Every communication was deliberate, structured in a way that minimized risk. I shared what I found, piece by piece, allowing them to map it against the legal framework we'd already discussed. With every new detail, the picture became clearer. There were patterns in how he handled assets, in how he documented agreements, in how he structured control. It wasn't random, it was systematic. And that meant it could be challenged, but only if everything was aligned correctly. That's when the strategy shifted from observation to orchestration. The lawyer explained that timing would be critical. If he was given any indication that something was wrong, he could move things quickly, reallocate assets, adjust documentation, create narratives that would complicate everything. The advantage I had was his assumption that I was unaware. Preserving that assumption became the priority. So I leaned into it completely. I became even more agreeable, more trusting, more aligned with his expectations than I had been before. If he suggested something, I supported it. If he explained a decision, I accepted it without hesitation. It wasn't submission, it was positioning. Every time he saw that version of me, it reinforced his belief that he was in control. And the more secure he felt, the more he revealed. There were moments when I had to hold back reactions that would have been natural before. Hearing him speak about our future, while knowing how carefully he had structured it to benefit only himself, required a level of restraint I hadn't known I was capable of. But reacting would have been a mistake. It would have shifted the dynamic, alerted him to the fact that something had changed. So I stayed consistent. At the same time, I began making small, strategic adjustments of my own. Nothing that would raise suspicion, nothing that could be traced back as a reaction. Just subtle shifts ensuring I had access to certain documents, securing copies of key records, organizing information in a way that could be used when the time came. I also started preparing for the moment when everything would come to light. Not emotionally, that part had already been processed, but structurally. The lawyer and I discussed how the confrontation should happen. What environment would limit his ability to control the narrative? What documentation would need to be presented and in what order? It wasn't about creating drama. It was about ensuring clarity, making it impossible for him to deflect or reinterpret what had been done. And through all of this, he remained unaware. If anything, he grew more confident with time. There was a shift in his demeanor, a sense of inevitability, as if he was already anticipating an outcome that had yet to occur. He spoke about the future with a level of certainty that now felt misplaced, almost naive. That was the irony of it. He had spent so much time planning, so much effort constructing a system that would secure his position, that he had stopped considering the possibility of it being challenged. His confidence wasn't just belief, it was assumption. And assumptions create blind spots. I watched those blind spots carefully, because every one of them was an opening. By the time everything was in place, the situation had completely reversed from what it had once been. He still believed he was in control. He still thought the narrative belonged to him. But the reality was different now. The evidence existed. The legal framework was understood. The strategy was aligned. All that remained was the moment it would be revealed, and I made sure that when that moment came, it wouldn't just expose what he had done. It would dismantle everything he thought he had secured. The day of the meeting arrived with a kind of stillness that felt almost unnatural. It wasn't dramatic or chaotic. Nothing outwardly signaled what was about to unfold. If anything, it felt like just another formal step in a process he believed he had already mastered. That was the most unsettling part, how ordinary it all seemed on the surface, how predictable he thought the outcome would be. He was calm that morning, confident in a way that bordered on casual. He moved through the house with the same controlled energy I had grown used to, adjusting small details, checking his phone, occasionally glancing at me as if everything was proceeding exactly as planned. There was no tension in him, no sign that he anticipated anything other than a smooth confirmation of what he believed was already secured. I matched his composure perfectly. I didn't rush, didn't show hesitation, didn't give him any indication that the stay carried a different weight for me. If anything, I was quieter than usual, but not in a way that would raise suspicion. Just enough to appear reflective, perhaps even slightly resigned. It fit the narrative he had constructed, that I would eventually accept whatever terms were presented, that I would follow the path he had already outlined. The meeting was scheduled in a professional setting, neutral ground that carried its own kind of authority. The room was structured, deliberate clean lines, polished surfaces, everything designed to keep emotions contained and focus directed. His lawyer was already there when we arrived, organized and prepared, papers arranged neatly as if the conclusion had already been written. There was a brief exchange of greetings, polite and controlled. I observed everything. The way his lawyer nodded at him with quiet assurance, the way he responded with that same subtle confidence, the way both of them moved through the opening formalities as if they were operating within a script they had rehearsed. For a moment, I allowed the silence to settle. It was important, because the silence gave them space to lean into their assumptions, to step fully into the version of reality they believed in. It let his lawyer begin with certainty, let him frame the conversation in a way that reflected the narrative they had prepared. The document was presented. Our prenup, his lawyer said, sliding it across the table with practiced ease. The tone was professional, but there was an underlying finality to it, as if this was the definitive version, the one that would dictate everything that followed. I didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, I let my gaze settle on it for a second longer than necessary, then shifted my attention to my husband. He was watching me, not closely enough to suggest concern, but with enough focus to register my reaction. He expected hesitation, maybe even quiet acceptance. What he didn't expect was what came next. I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, and placed a second envelope on the table. There was no dramatic movement, no sudden reveal. Just a controlled, precise action that interrupted the rhythm of the room in the most subtle way possible. For a brief moment, no one spoke. His lawyer's attention shifted first, eyes moving from the document they had presented to the one I had just introduced. There was a flicker of curiosity, quickly replaced by professional neutrality. My husband's reaction came a fraction of a second later. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A slight tightening in his expression. A pause that lasted just long enough to register before he corrected it, but I saw it. Because I was looking for it. Before we continue, I said calmly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I think it's important we review this version as well. I slid the envelope forward. The lawyer hesitated, just for a moment, then opened it. The room shifted again, but this time the change was more tangible. The confidence that had filled the space earlier didn't disappear, it fractured. Page by page, the lawyer reviewed the document. Slowly, carefully. The difference in pace was immediate. Where the first document had been handled with familiarity, this one demanded attention. It wasn't just being read, it was being analyzed, compared, questioned. I watched as the lawyer's posture changed, subtle but undeniable. The certainty from earlier gave way to concentration, to a kind of recalibration that couldn't be hidden behind professionalism. My husband remained still beside me, but the stillness wasn't the same as before. It wasn't confidence anymore. It was control and effort to maintain composure as something unexpected unfolded. "What is this?" the lawyer asked finally, looking up. The question wasn't directed at me alone. It hung between all of us, carrying more weight than the words themselves. "This," I replied, maintaining eye contact, "is the version that was originally drafted." There was no accusation in my tone, no emotion, just clarity. The lawyer looked back down at the document, flipping through sections more quickly now, cross-referencing, scanning for inconsistencies. It didn't take long for the differences to become undeniable. "This doesn't match the agreement we have on file," they said. The earlier confidence now replaced with something far more cautious. I turned slightly, just enough to face my husband. For the first time since the meeting began, he didn't meet my gaze immediately. It was a small detail, but it said everything. Because in that moment, the narrative he had constructed, the one he had relied on, the one he believed would carry him through this began to unravel. Not explosively, not in a way that could be easily dismissed or redirected, but precisely. Every assumption he had made about control, about timing, about outcome, was being challenged in real time. And there was nothing he could do to stop it without revealing exactly what he had been trying to hide. The moment the second document was fully understood in that room, everything stopped feeling like a private negotiation and started feeling like a public collapse in slow motion. What I had expected, what I had carefully prepared for, wasn't just his reaction, but the chain reaction that would follow once his version of reality could no longer hold. At first, his family wasn't even part of the room. But the moment the lawyer began identifying inconsistencies out loud, the shift was immediate. A phone call was made. Then another. Within a short span of time that felt both too fast and strangely inevitable, his side of the family began to arrive, one after another, as if summoned by instinct rather than information. They entered with confidence, the kind that comes from years of believing one narrative without question. His mother was the first to speak, her voice carrying concern that quickly sharpened into authority once she understood something was wrong. His elder brother followed, trying to assess the situation with the mindset of someone used to resolving disputes before they escalate. They all assumed, at least initially, that this was a misunderstanding, something procedural, something that could be corrected with explanation and reassurance. But the room had already changed. The lawyer didn't soften the facts. They laid everything out with precision, comparing clauses, highlighting contradictions, pointing out structural differences between the two documents. Each explanation removed another layer of ambiguity, until there was no space left for interpretation. What remained was not confusion, but clarity, uncomfortable, undeniable clarity. And clarity, once it enters a room like that, doesn't stay neutral. It shifts power. His family's reactions evolved in real time. First, disbelief, then denial. Then a growing discomfort that began to surface in the way they interrupted, questioned, and tried to redirect the conversation. They wanted context that would justify what they were hearing, but context no longer helped. The structure of what had been done was already visible. My husband tried to intervene several times, but not forcefully. His control, which had always been calm and measured, was now inconsistent. He attempted to frame parts of the situation as misunderstandings, to minimize certain details, to redirect attention away from key sections of the documents. But every attempt required more effort than the last, and every effort made the gaps more visible. His lawyer, who had entered the room with confidence, was now visibly recalibrating. Questions were no longer directed toward me, they were directed toward him. Clarifications were being requested that couldn't be answered cleanly without exposing intent. And that was the point where everything started shifting beyond recovery. His mother, who had initially defended him without hesitation, began to fall silent. Not immediately convinced, but no longer able to maintain certainty. There is a particular moment in situations like this where belief doesn't disappear, it fractures. You can see it in how someone stops arguing and starts processing instead. That happened in real time. The turning point came when the lawyer explained the implications, not just the differences. It wasn't just about two documents existing. It was about what those differences meant in legal terms, how intent could be interpreted, how misrepresentation could alter enforceability, how structured concealment changed the nature of consent itself. That word consent changed the atmosphere completely, because it shifted the focus away from paperwork and into something far more personal and irreversible. His family looked at him differently after that, not immediately in anger, but in reassessment, as if they were trying to understand how much of what they believed about him still held. He tried again, this time more controlled, more deliberate. He spoke about misunderstandings, about timing, about complexity, but the language no longer carried weight in the same way. When structural intent has been identified, explanation starts to sound like avoidance. And that was when I stopped being the focus of their attention entirely. For the first time, the room wasn't trying to interpret me or my actions. It was evaluating him. That shift was subtle but absolute. His brother asked direct questions then, not aggressive but pointed. Questions about documentation, about sequence, about why certain versions existed at all. His answers were careful, but care was no longer enough. Every response required framing, and every framing created another gap. The lawyer representing him began to step in more cautiously, attempting to stabilize the situation, but the foundation they were working from had already changed. You cannot stabilize something once the base assumption has collapsed. At some point during the exchange, his mother stopped speaking entirely. She simply watched, her expression shifting between disbelief and reluctant recognition. That silence was louder than any argument. I remained still throughout all of it. Not passive, but contained. Because this was not the moment for escalation. It was the moment for observation. Everything I had prepared was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding exactly as it needed to, without interference. The exposure wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was structural, legal, social. Each layer of support he had relied on was being tested simultaneously, and each layer was responding differently. Some resisted, some weakened, some simply stopped functioning altogether. By the time the discussion reached its peak intensity, there was no single voice guiding the room anymore. There were fragments of interpretation, competing attempts to regain control, and increasing awareness that control itself had already shifted. And in that fragmentation, his position once assumed stable was no longer anchored to anything solid. The final stage didn't feel like a dramatic collapse in the way people imagine revenge stories to unfold. There were no sudden outbursts, no chaotic shouting, no cinematic breakdown. Instead, it was something far more unsettling. A quiet, irreversible unraveling that happened in layers, each one stripping away another assumption he had built his entire life on. By the time everything had been presented and examined, the legal reality was no longer something that could be argued against. It had been documented, reviewed, and acknowledged by multiple parties in the room. What remained wasn't interpretation, it was consequences. And consequences, once they reach that level of clarity, don't negotiate. He tried in the beginning to hold on to fragments of control, not in obvious ways, but through language. He attempted to reframe intent, to soften meaning, to suggest that what had been uncovered was a misunderstanding of process rather than a reflection of deliberate action. But every attempt required more effort than the last, and every explanation seemed to create more distance between him and the version of events he was trying to preserve. The lawyer representing him no longer spoke with certainty. That shift alone said more than any argument could. Confidence in legal spaces is not emotional. It is structural. When that structure begins to weaken, everything built on top of it starts to lose stability. You could see it in the way documents were handled more slowly, in the pauses between responses, in the way clarification replaced assertion. His family, who had once entered the room with unified belief, were now divided internally. Some still tried to defend him out of instinct. Others had moved into silence, and a few were clearly reevaluating everything they thought they knew. That kind of fracture doesn't repair itself quickly. It lingers, reshaping relationships long after the moment has passed. And through all of this, I remained composed. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. There is a difference between witnessing collapse and being consumed by it. I had already lived through the emotional phase long before this room ever saw the documents. By the time everything became visible to others, I had already processed what it meant. So while they were reacting to discovery, I was observing resolution. The final confirmation came when the legal interpretation was no longer in question. The structure he had relied on, the version of agreements he had presented, enforced, and protected was no longer the dominant version. It had been challenged successfully, and in that challenge, its authority had weakened to the point where it could no longer dictate outcomes in the way he had intended. That moment changed the tone of everything that followed. Because once authority shifts, even slightly, the balance of power does not return to its original state. It recalibrates permanently. He realized it before anyone needed to say it out loud. You could see it in the way he stopped trying to control the conversation and started trying to understand what options remained. The shift from control to calculation is always visible if you know what to look for. It appears in the silence between words, in the reduction of unnecessary arguments, and the focus on outcomes rather than justification. But there were no outcomes available that restored what had been lost, not in the way he wanted. The discussion eventually moved from confrontation to formal closure. There were procedural steps, confirmations, acknowledgements. Papers were referenced again, not as weapons this time, but as records of what had already been established. The energy in the room had changed completely. What had once been tension had become finality. When it ended, there was no single defining moment of victory or defeat. That's not how real resolution works in situations like this. Instead, there was a gradual dispersal of intensity, as if everyone in the room had collectively recognized that continuing further would not change the outcome that had already taken shape. Outside that space, the world continued as normal. That contrast was almost surreal. Inside the room, everything had shifted permanently. Outside, nothing had yet caught up. He did not speak much afterward. There was nothing left to argue in the same way, and anything further would have required a different kind of conversation, one that acknowledges consequence rather than resists it. His family left in stages, each departure carrying a different emotional weight. Some avoided eye contact. Others lingered slightly longer than necessary, as if trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with the version of him they had always known. But reconciliation, at that point, was not immediate. It rarely is. When I finally stepped out, there was no dramatic sense of triumph. That is not what closure feels like when it is built on structure rather than emotion. Instead, there was clarity, a clear understanding that the version of events he had controlled for so long no longer dictated what came next. Everything that had been hidden had already been revealed. Everything that had been assumed had already been tested. And everything that remained now existed in a different reality than the one he had spent years constructing. I didn't walk away feeling like a winner in the way people expect from revenge stories. There was no rush of satisfaction, no dramatic relief, no sudden sense that everything had become perfect again. What I felt instead was something quieter, more grounded clarity. The kind that comes when confusion finally stops having power over you. What he built didn't collapse in one moment. It unraveled in layers, and each layer revealed something I could no longer unsee. Trust, once broken at that level, doesn't rebuild itself in the same shape. It forces you to see people as they are, not as you hoped they would be. When I left that room, I wasn't carrying anger anymore. I was carrying understanding, and that changed everything. Because understanding doesn't push you backward into pain. It pushes you forward into decisions that finally belong to you.